They never wrote her name in any record. Not in the plantation ledger, not in the county registry, not in the church rolls her father kept locked in the mahogany cabinet beside his whiskey. She was simply the master's daughter, the one who smiled at things no one else could see, who wept when the wind changed direction, who whispered to her reflection in the hall mirror as though it were a different girl trapped inside the glass and not her own face looking back. She was 8 years old when her mother died. She was 8 years old when her father walked her down the hill, bare feet in the red Mississippi mud, her small hand swallowed inside his, and left her with the people he had broken. He said the women in the quarters knew how to tend to broken things. He said this as if he were doing the child a kindness. What no one understood, not the women who took her in, not the overseer who passed through and never asked questions, not the father who convinced himself that distance was the same thing as grace, was that by the time he left her standing in the dirt of the slave quarters, the little girl had already learned everything she would ever need to know about love. She had learned it from him. She had learned it the way children always learn the worst lessons, not from what they are told, but from what they witness over and over, until it becomes the only shape the world takes in their minds. And what she became among those women, what she carried into their cabins and pressed against their hearts like a coal still burning, did not break them all at once. It broke them the way water breaks stone. Slowly, quietly, from the inside out. Before we go any further, if you found this story, you found this channel for a reason. Subscribe to Hollow Century right now and ring the bell. Every week we go into the parts of history that the powerful tried to bury, and we stay there until the full truth comes up into the light. Now, let us go back to Mississippi. The year is 1846, and the house on the hill has just gone silent. The mistress of the Brantham plantation died in the 3rd week of September, just as the cotton fields reached their fullest white. There was no illness that anyone could point to cleanly. She had been thin for a long time, quiet for longer than that. The women who bathed and dressed her spoke later in careful voices of bruises they never mentioned and a look in her eyes that had nothing to do with the harvest season or the heat. But those women knew the rules of that world, and the first rule was that what happened inside the walls of the big house was not a story any of them had the right to tell. So they washed her and pressed her, and kept her secrets folded up tight as her Sunday linens, and they did not speak of it to anyone, not because they did not care, but because caring on that land had a cost, and they had already paid more than their share. When she died, the house changed its sound entirely. It was not the sound of grief that settled in. It was the sound of something heavier, the particular silence of a place where the only person who had absorbed the worst of a man's nature is suddenly gone, and that nature has nowhere left to go. A silence with pressure behind it, a silence that leaned against the walls. The master ordered the mirrors draped in black cloth. He ordered the long case clock stopped in the front hall, ordered it stopped at the exact hour she had been pronounced, as though time itself was something he could punish for what it had done. He ordered the drapes drawn in every room, every window, as if sunlight was something he had decided he no longer deserved or perhaps no longer trusted. The house slaves moved through those dim hallways like shadows navigating by memory, afraid to make sounds that might remind him they existed. They buried the mistress on the hill behind the house, beneath 2 magnolia trees that had stood there since before anyone on that land could remember. The slaves were not permitted near the grave. They stood at the tree line instead, heads bowed, their presence tolerated the way the weather is tolerated, acknowledged but not addressed. The little girl Leah stood at the graveside in a white dress that was already too small for her. She held the edge of her father's coat. She did not cry. She watched the coffin lowered with the expression of a child who has been told what death means by the wrong kind of people, not with tenderness, not with faith, but as a fact delivered without cushioning, the way you tell a field hand what time work starts in the morning. She watched until the last shovelful of dirt hit the wood. Then she looked up at her father. He did not look back. The days that followed the funeral were grey and formless. The master locked himself inside his study for 3 full days. He refused food. He refused the housekeeper's soft knock at the door. He sat in there with his bottles and his ledger and whatever version of the truth he was constructing for himself, the story where he was the grieving husband rather than the man whose wife had spent 7 years learning how to become invisible. When he finally emerged on the 4th morning, he was unshaven and hollowed out. His eyes had acquired a new quality, something that sat behind the usual coldness, not exactly guilt, more like the fear of guilt, which in a man like him always curdled quickly into resentment because guilt requires a willingness to sit with the thing you have done. And the master was not a man who sat with things. He did not call for his daughter. He did not ask the housekeeper how the child had slept or eaten or whether she had cried in the night. Leia had been wandering the halls alone since the funeral, carrying her mother's ivory comb and singing to herself in a tuneless way that the house servants found deeply unsettling. Essie, the head housekeeper, a tall woman of extraordinary stillness who had kept that house running through more than one catastrophe by the simple force of her refusal to be broken, told the cook that the girl had taken to standing in front of her mother's draped mirror and talking to it in a soft, steady voice. As if the cloth was not there, as if the woman on the other side could still hear her. "She keeps looking for her," Essie said quietly in the kitchen, away from ears that reported upward. "She talks to the reflection like it's still the mistress in there." But the mistress was in the ground under the magnolias, and the master had decided that his daughter's grief was simply one more thing in that house he did not wish to look at directly. Within 2 weeks of the burial, something had spread through Leia like weather through an open window. She sat in corners for hours, tearing at the hem of her dress with her thumbnail, pressing the loose threads into patterns only she could see. She laughed suddenly, hard and sharp, at nothing anyone else could perceive. She screamed when touched without warning, a high animal sound completely out of proportion to the contact, as if every unexpected hand on her confirmed something she already believed about what hands did. She spoke in fragments that unnerved even the most experienced among the servants. Not cruel fragments, just broken ones, pieces of conversations she had overheard, sentences with the beginnings sawed off, truths delivered without any of the social cushioning that makes truths bearable. The master watched none of this, or he watched it and decided that it was the women's domain, this kind of leaking, inconvenient female feeling, and so it fell outside the geography of his concern. Then one evening after supper, he made a decision. He called for the overseer's man and told him to send word to the quarters that the women should expect company in the morning. He did not say what kind. He did not ask for any opinion on the matter. The next morning, just as the mist was still low across the fields and the October light had not yet committed to warmth, the slaves working near the fence line saw him coming down the hill. He walked with the posture of a man performing composure. Behind him, 2 of the housemen followed at a respectful distance, and beside him, her small hand now entirely absent from his, swinging loose at her side, walked the child. She was barefoot, her hair was unbraided, tangled at the ends. She held a rag doll missing one arm pressed against her ribs. The doll had been her mother's once passed down, and somewhere in the transfer between them something about the toy had changed. It had absorbed both women's hands, or seemed to, the fabric soft as old skin at the places they had held it most. When they reached the edge of the quarters, the master stopped. He said the girl would be staying with them for a time. He said he had business that demanded his full concentration. He said the women down here had a way with children, that they understood this kind of tending. He said it with the practiced ease of a man who has learned to make the things he does to other people sound like favors he is doing them. Then he turned around and walked back up the hill without looking at the child. She stood in the red dirt of the quarters, her dress wrong for the place, her feet already dark with mud, her eyes moving over the faces staring at her with an expression that was not quite fear and not quite wonder, but something that lived between the two, the expression of a person who has arrived somewhere new and is trying to determine, before they commit to any emotion, whether this new place is safer than the last. For a long time after he disappeared over the rise, no one moved, no one spoke. They just stood looking at the small figure of the man's daughter, planted among them like something he had decided he no longer needed to water. The first night, no one slept easily. The women lay on their narrow cots in the dark, listening to the fire settle and the child breathe, and each one turned the same questions over in her mind without finding any answers that fit comfortably. Leia sat on a low stool near the hearth, her bare feet tucked up under the hem of her dress, the one-armed doll balanced across her knees. She watched the fire with the focused attention of a child who has been told it contains something important. Her lips moved sometimes, but no sound came out. Old Mabel rose first. She was the midwife of the Brantham quarters, a woman whose back had been bent by decades of lifting other people's heaviest hours, whose hands had brought more lives into the world than she could count, and whose face had learned to hold tenderness and grief in the same expression simultaneously, because on that particular piece of land, the two were rarely apart for long. She moved the way she did everything, without hurry, without waste, each motion deliberate and considered, the way of a person who has understood for a long time that energy, like all precious things, must not be spent carelessly. She crossed the cabin floor and knelt beside the girl with the careful movement of old joints that know how to make themselves gentle. She held out a small wooden cup of warm milk. "Here now, baby," she said softly. "Drink this, you'll sleep easy." Leia did not reach for the cup. Her eyes stayed on the fire. Then she turned her head slowly, as if the motion required deliberate effort, and looked at Mabel with eyes that were too steady and too old for the face they sat in. "Papa says fire eats people when they lie," she said. The word dropped into the room like a stone into still water, and the silence that followed had rings. Mabel held the cup very still. In the darkness of the cots behind her, she heard the other women go quieter than they had already been, quieter than silence, which is a specific quality that people learn when they need to hear everything and show nothing. "No, child," she said after a moment, smoothing her voice out like a wrinkle in cloth. "Fire keeps folks warm, that's all it does." Leia looked back at the flames. She reached out and took the cup, drank it without taking her eyes off the fire. Later, when the women were sure the girl was sleeping, they talked in the lowest registers of their voices, the ones they used for things that needed to leave no trace. "Why he bring her here?" one of the younger women asked. "She got a bed up there, she got a whole room to herself." Mabel was quiet for a moment. "Because she don't fit nowhere," she finally said. "She too much like her mama to be kept comfortable and not enough like her own kind to be put away." Ruth, Essie's niece, young, sharp-tongued, smart in the way that danger sometimes is, leaned from her cot. "She looks simple to me, like she ain't all the way there." Mabel's look came quick and flat in the dark. "Don't you call no child simple? God makes all his creatures the way he sees fit. Ain't her fault she was born to the wrong kind of people." From the corner, the girl stirred. Her doll slid from her grasp and hit the dirt floor face down. And then she began to hum. It was not a pretty sound. It was slightly off-key, and it moved in a rhythm that did not belong to any song any of them recognized. But it was tender in its own broken way, the way a thing that has been dropped and glued back together is still tender, still holds its shape, still functions even if the cracks are visible. The sound filled the cabin. The crickets outside seemed to pause. Even the fire quieted, or seemed to. When she finished, she looked at the women with a faint, unreadable smile. "Mama used to sing that when Papa got mad," she said. "She said it made the loud parts smaller." No one spoke for a long time after that. That night, Ruth woke to find the girl standing beside her cot in the dark, holding the doll by its single arm, her face inches from Ruth's own. Ruth did not scream. The instinct for silence on that land ran deeper than the instinct for fear. "Papa said bad girls get sent here," Leia whispered. Her breath was shallow, her eyes enormous in the dark. "He said you know how to fix them." Ruth lay very still. The girl leaned closer. "Can you fix me?" Then she turned and walked back to her corner and curled on the dirt floor with the doll pressed against her chest, and did not make another sound until morning. By the time the sun came up through the low window, and the birds began their business in the trees, and the day started assembling itself out of ordinary things, everyone in the quarters understood one thing with perfect clarity. The child they had been given was not evil, she was not simple, she was not a threat in the way her father was a threat, deliberate, calculated, sure of its own authority. She was something harder to hold. She was a vessel still full of everything she had witnessed, and the contents were dangerous not because she intended them to be, but because she did not yet know that what she carried was not the same thing as love. The second week went more easily on the surface, which is the way things often get harder. Leia found her place in the rhythm of the quarters the way water finds low ground, not by choosing, but by following the path of least resistance. She fell in beside the women at their work. She fetched water, held the babies on her hip, peeled potatoes, swept dirt from doorways. She was quick with her hands and eager to be useful in the way that children are when being useful feels like the closest available substitute for being wanted. The women were careful with her. They did not rush her, did not crowd her, did not make sudden movements in her direction. They had dealt with enough animals that had been handled badly to know that the first thing you do with a frightened creature is give it room to decide on its own terms whether you are safe. You do not prove it. You wait for the creature to arrive at the conclusion itself, which is the only way it ever sticks. She liked to sit beside Ruth at the washing tubs, dragging her fingers through the soapy water, watching the suds run. She would hum while Ruth scrubbed, and Ruth would catch herself humming back before she realized it was happening, the two of them locked in a soundless agreement that neither of them had words for. It was easy to forget in those moments what she was, or rather who she was. But the forgetting never lasted. One morning the overseer came through the yard on his inspection route, and Leah's shoulders went rigid before the man had fully rounded the corner. Her head dropped, her eyes went to the ground. She stood exactly as the other women stood, still and folded inward, taking up as little of the world as possible. Not because she had been told to, because she had seen it done. Mabel watched this and felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the morning air. When the overseer shouted at one of the men for a slow pace, the sudden, practiced violence of his voice landing across the yard like a thrown thing, Leah turned her face away and murmured something under her breath. Mabel caught it, leaned in. "What you say, child?" Leah blinked, looked up with the calm certainty of someone reporting a known fact. "Papa says you beat them till they listen. He says it's the only language idle men understand." The words were delivered without malice, without inflection. That was what made them so terrible. They were simply facts in the child's mind. The way the sky is blue, the way the river runs south. "Don't you ever say that again," Mabel said, quietly but with a weight behind it that was not anger so much as grief. "That ain't truth. That's something a broken man told himself so he could sleep at night." Leah tilted her head with genuine curiosity. "Then why does Papa sleep fine?" Mabel had no answer for that. That night she told the others what the child had said. Nobody laughed. Ruth crossed herself slowly. One of the older women, Clara, pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling. "She ain't meaning harm," she said at last. "She just got harm living in her like it's furniture. She don't even know to move around it." But knowing it was not harm did not make it harmless. Over the following days, the small behaviors multiplied and sharpened. Leah began to point at things she wanted rather than asking for them. She snapped her fingers at the younger children when she needed them to move her small wrist, executing the gesture with an unconscious precision that was unmistakably her father's, the gesture of a person who has never needed to ask. She spoke to the little ones in a tone that was not cruel but that carried the same weight of expectation, that things would be done correctly, that sloppiness would be noted, that the master used when he came through the quarters on his rare inspections. When the women corrected her, she frowned with genuine confusion. "But that's how proper folks talk," she would say. "Papa says common people need clear direction." They did not scold her. They knew the difference between a child who chose cruelty and a child who had been given cruelty as her first language. But correcting the language without being able to correct the entire curriculum that had produced it was its own kind of helplessness, and they felt it. The heartbreaking moments came in equal measure. Ruth found her one morning sitting on the steps outside, holding the doll upside down by its remaining arm, whispering to it, "Don't cry, Mama. Papa said don't cry. He said crying is only for people who don't understand why things have to happen." Ruth knelt beside her in the dirt. "Who you talking to, sugar?" Leah looked up and her face was completely open, completely sincere. "Mama's inside this one," she said, holding the doll gently against her cheek. "She told me she ain't gone nowhere, she just got small." Ruth brushed the hair back from the girl's forehead, her hands careful and slow. "Then you keep her safe, you hear?" Leah nodded seriously. "I will, but Papa says small things get lost if you don't hold them tight enough." She pressed the doll harder against her chest. "I hold her real tight." Ruth walked away with water in her eyes that she refused to let fall. That night Mabel sat at the edge of her cot in the dark and listened to the girl's breathing. Even in sleep, it was slightly uneven, catching, releasing, catching again, as if some part of her was still braced for something that might come through the door. "She don't know what she is," Mabel whispered to the air. "Not his, not ours. That kind of loss don't mend on a schedule." Outside, the Mississippi night did what it always did. It got wide and dark and indifferent. The crickets sang in the grass. The magnolias on the hill stood silver in the moonlight. And from the corner of the cabin, the faint, uneven sound of a child's humming rose and fell like something trying to find its way back to a tune it had almost forgotten. If you are watching this and you have not yet subscribed to Hollow Century, now is the time. Hit subscribe, hit the bell. Stories like this one were never meant to survive. We keep them alive so they cannot be forgotten again. Stay with us. By the time the cotton had been brought in, and the fields stood bare and exhausted under the November sky, Leah had become something that the women in the quarters could neither name cleanly nor stop thinking about. She was theirs in the way that anything left in your care long enough becomes yours. They had braided her hair and healed her scraped knees and let her sleep warm beside the babies and taught her to knead bread and to know when the fire needed tending by sound rather than sight. They had given her everything they had to give, which was not small, even on that land, even in those circumstances. The women of those quarters had been stripped of almost everything, their names, their families, their labor, their bodies, and what they had left, what could never be fully taken, was the exact knowledge of how to survive, how to make something from almost nothing, how to love carefully in a place where love was always at risk, how to keep the inside of a person intact when the outside is not your own. They gave all of that to this child, and she received it with the openness of a cup left out in the rain. But the cup had a crack in it, and through that crack, her father kept leaking in. It was not that she imitated him deliberately. She was not performing. There was no calculation behind it. She had simply spent the first 8 years of her life absorbing the rhythms of a particular kind of power, and those rhythms had laid themselves down in her body the way music lays itself down beneath the level of conscious thought, in the muscles and the breath and the particular angle of the head, when addressing someone you have been taught to see as lesser. The body remembers what it has witnessed long before the mind understands what the witnessing has done to it. The pointing, the snapping, the flat expectation of immediate compliance, the way she sometimes stood over the smaller children with her hands on her hips in a posture that belonged entirely to him. One evening, as the light went gold and heavy across the yard, and the day's work began its last slow easing, Ruth found Leah standing over one of the small boys, her hand raised, her face hard and certain. The boy had spilled a bucket of water. It spread across the dirt in a dark stain between them. Ruth caught Leah's wrist before the blow landed. The sound of her own stopped motion seemed to startle the girl. She looked at Ruth with an expression cycling rapidly through something, authority, confusion, then a crumbling that was almost collapse. "Don't you hurt nobody here," Ruth said, not cruelly. "We don't do that, not to each other." The certainty dissolved out of Leah's face. Her lip trembled, and then she began to cry, not in the way children cry from pain or fear, but in the bewildered, desolate way of someone who does not understand why they are wrong but believes all the way down that they are, that they have always been wrong, that being wrong is a fundamental condition of their existence and not a correctable error. Ruth pulled her close and held her, and the girl shook against her ribs. "He ain't here, baby," Ruth said. "You don't got to be him." That night Leah sat outside the cabin alone after supper. She did not eat. The fireflies blinked and rose around her in slow constellations, each one a brief insistence on light in the dark. When Mabel came to check, she found her whispering to the doll in the dark. "I did what Papa said," she murmured, "and now I'm bad too." Mabel crouched beside her. "No, you just don't know different yet. That ain't the same as bad." Leah looked up with her mother's eyes full of her father's damage. "Then who is going to teach me different?" Mabel opened her mouth, closed it again. Because the honest answer was that she was already trying, and she did not know yet whether it was working, and the kind of teaching the child needed involved undoing something that had been built into her before language itself, and Mabel was a wise woman, but she was not sure any wisdom was equal to that particular task. The damage was not in the behavior was only the evidence. The damage was in the architecture, in the fundamental shape of the world that had been built inside this girl before she had the tools to evaluate it. What she said instead was, "We are, all of us, you already in school, baby, you just don't know it yet." Weeks that passed after that were a study in contradiction. Leah grew softer in some moments and harder in others, as if whatever was shifting in her was doing so in alternating layers, the women's patience reaching in, the father's voice pushing back. She stopped pointing so much. She asked for things with words. She brought the babies their blankets without being asked and sat with the smallest ones through the night when they were sick with fever, her hand on their foreheads, her low hum in the air above them. But she still sometimes arranged the tools in the precise order her father kept his study. She still sometimes fell into a particular silence when the overseer came through, not just fear, but something that looked more like studied readiness, the posture of someone who has learned to calculate danger from a great distance. And she still repeated the phrases, "Papa says bad ones spoil the rest. Papa says quiet is a kind of obedience. Papa says some things have to break before they can be useful." Mabel, hearing these, would say gently each time, "That ain't a rule, baby. That's a lie somebody told themselves." And the girl would nod and look confused and carry the phrase with her anyway, the way you carry something in your pocket that you know you should put down, but that keeps finding its way back into your hand because it was placed there before you understood what it was. The master came down to the quarters on a Tuesday morning in early December, the day after a hard rain had turned the paths between the cabins to red clay. He came alone, no overseers behind him. He walked with his hands in his coat pockets and his jaw set in the way it always was when he needed to appear at ease, and the appearing was costing him something. His boots sank into the wet earth with each step, leaving deep prints that filled slowly with water behind him. The women saw him coming, and the work fell quiet the way birdsong falls quiet when a hawk crosses the sky. Hands stopped mid-motion, eyes moved to him and then carefully away. He called for Mabel. She came forward, her hands folded together in front of her, her face arranged in the particular expression enslaved people learn to make: attentive, neutral, revealing nothing. The face that is a locked room behind a presentable door. "How's the girl?" he asked. He said it as a man asks about livestock, not cruelly but without sentiment, as a matter of management, as though the welfare of his own child was a ledger entry. "She eats," Mabel said. "She sleeps. The others look after her." "Good," he nodded once as if this confirmed something he had already decided. "Keep her clean, teach her to work, shell peas, carry water, nothing heavy." He paused. The pause had an edge in it. "And don't let her forget who she is." The sentence hung in the cold December, air like breath made visible. Mabel said nothing. He had already turned to go when Leia came running from behind one of the cabins, barefoot, mud up to her ankles, her hair wild around her face. She pulled up short when she saw him. The momentum of her running drained out of her all at once, and she stood there in the mud with her chest still heaving. "Papa," she said. The word was soft. It had hope in it, not the demand of a child who expects to be embraced, but the smaller, more careful hope of a child who has learned to expect very little and still cannot stop the wanting, who has discovered that hope is not a decision but a reflex, firing whether you sanction it or not. He looked at her. The looking lasted perhaps 2 seconds. "Mind what they tell you, girl," he said. "Work hard, be useful." He turned and walked back up the hill. Leia stood in the mud and watched him until he was gone from sight, then for a full minute after that, watching the empty space where he had been, as if his outline might still be hanging in the air, as if the shape of him had more staying power than the man himself. Then she looked at Mabel. "Papa talks to God like that too," she said quietly. "Like God is standing somewhere close and already knows the answer, and Papa just has to say the words so it counts." Mabel could not answer that. What she was thinking was this: the child was not repeating her father anymore. She was beginning to understand him. And understanding him, at 8 years old, in the body of a girl he had left in a slave cabin because the sight of her face called up too much, was going to cost her something that could not be replaced. That night the fire burned low and the women stayed awake longer than usual. Clara spoke what the others were thinking. She's going to carry him the rest of her life. Ruth pulled her knees to her chest. "Not if we teach her to put him down." "You can teach a person how to set something down," Mabel said slowly. "But if they've been carrying it since before they could walk, it starts to feel like part of their body. Setting it down feel like losing a limb." No one argued. Outside, the December wind moved through the magnolias on the hill, and somewhere up in the dark house, a single lamp burned in the study window and stayed burning until after midnight. You are watching Hollow Century. If this story is reaching you, subscribe, leave a comment, share this with someone who needs to hear it. The stories we tell here do not belong to us. They belong to the people who lived them. The least we can do is make sure they are heard. The cotton bloomed again the following summer, white and indifferent as it always was, and by then Leia's feet had calloused from months of running barefoot in the yard, and her skin had darkened in the Mississippi sun, and her hair had grown long and tangled and wild at the ends, and she looked so different from the pale, overdressed child the master had brought down the hill the previous autumn that when he appeared one morning at the edge of the quarters on horseback, dressed in his good coat and his polished boots. 2 overseers flanking him at a respectful distance, several of the women did not recognize what was happening for a full moment. Then they did. Tools went silent, conversations died, even the cicadas seemed to hold their sound. He sat on his horse and let his eyes move across the quarters with the assessing expression of a man reviewing his inventory. When his gaze reached Leia, crouched near the fence with a row of twigs arranged in careful lines in the dirt, he frowned. "What is she doing?" he asked Mabel. Mabel hesitated a moment too long. "Playing," she finally said. "She makes things, keeps her quiet." He dismounted and walked closer. His shadow fell across the girl's work. She looked up when she saw his boots and smiled at him slowly, with the calm recognition of someone who has been expecting a person and has rehearsed how to greet them. "Papa," she said, "you come to see my house." He stared at the arrangement of sticks. Each one stood upright in a small mound of pressed dirt, arranged in 2 neat rows with a narrow path running between them. "What house?" he said. "This one," she gestured at the rows. "It is where the good ones go when they stop needing to cry. Mama is in the back row on the left. She said she could see the river from there." The color in his face changed. "Who taught you that?" "You did," she said perfectly plainly, as if she were identifying the color of his coat. For a moment no one breathed. Something moved behind his eyes that might have been guilt or might have been something it shared a neighborhood with, the particular discomfort of a man who has become, in the mouth of a child, too accurately himself. He turned to Mabel. "You taught her this?" Mabel's voice came out steady. "No, sir, we ain't taught her nothing like that." He looked at Leia again. She had gone back to her work, pressing the dirt carefully around each little stick grave with the methodical focus of someone doing important and irreplaceable work. "Get her washed," he said. His voice had gone flat and cold, the tone he used when he had made a decision and was already tired of it. "She is coming back up to the house." Mabel's hands gripped each other behind her back. "Sir, she is settled here. She is eating and she is well. Moving her again might." "She is my blood." The sentence had the finality of a door closing. "I will not have her living like one of you." He turned and walked back toward his horse. Mabel looked at the child. Leia was still pressing dirt around her stick grave. "Did I make him mad again?" she asked. Ruth knelt beside her. "No, baby, you didn't do nothing wrong." "Yes, I did." Her voice was thin and certain, the certainty of a child who has learned this lesson many times and believes she has learned it correctly. "Papa says bad ones make him tired. I make him tired." She pressed her hands together in her lap. "Maybe if I go real quiet for long enough, he will stop seeing me when he looks my way." That night she did not eat supper. She sat by the doorway in the dying light, humming her mother's broken song, and the sound of it drifted through the quarters like wood smoke, soft and clinging, getting into everything, staying long after the source was gone. Mabel watched her from the darkness of the cabin and whispered to no one in particular, "Lord help her. He is taking her back to fix her, but she don't need fixing. She needs someone to sit with her in the part of herself that got broke, and he is the one who broke it." The next morning, he came for her. She walked toward him when he called, pausing just once to look back at the women gathered in the yard. Mabel gave her the smallest nod, a nod that tried to hold everything it could in the space a nod is allowed to occupy. Ruth did not look directly at the girl because she was afraid of what her own face would do if she did. He lifted Leia onto the horse and swung into the saddle behind her. She sat with her back very straight against his coat, her face turned into the wind, her small hands resting on the pommel. They rode up the hill together. That night the house blazed with lights for the first time in a year. The old piano somewhere inside played in uneven fits and starts, as if someone with unpracticed hands was forcing it back into service, filling a silence that had grown too heavy to bear. From the quarters, Ruth stood in the doorway and watched the glow. "He took her back," she said, "to kill what is left of her." Inside the house, things moved in the way that things move when a wound is being pressed rather than treated. The master had the housekeeper prepare Leia's old room. He had the linens changed and a new candle set on the nightstand and a dress laid out on the end of the bed, a dress that fit neither who she had been before nor who she had become in the quarters, but which represented, at least, the category of person he wanted her to occupy again. She sat at the dinner table that first evening with her hands folded on the tablecloth, her back straight, her eyes downcast. He poured himself a drink. He told her that she would eat properly now, speak properly, conduct herself as befitted her name. He told her the time in the quarters had been a temporary arrangement necessitated by difficult circumstances, and that those circumstances were behind them. She nodded. She said, "Yes, sir." But the way she said it gave him pause. Her voice had dropped slightly on the "sir." The inflection was his own, not mocking. She had no capacity for mockery, not that kind. But she had absorbed his authority so completely that it had begun to live in her voice even when she was directing it back toward him. He was hearing himself in the mouth of a child, and it had the unnerving quality of all true mirrors. He said, "What did you say?" She blinked, confused. "I said yes, sir." The glass in his hand was very still. He let it pass. He told her to go to bed. She rose obediently from her chair and walked to the doorway of the dining room, and there she paused with her hand on the frame and said, not loudly, not with any edge, "Papa talks too much too." Then her small footsteps moved away down the hall. He sat alone at the table, with the echo of her voice bouncing off the dark walls. The days after her return followed a pattern that the house staff observed with a shared, wordless dread. She followed him everywhere, not clingingly, not the way a child follows a parent out of need, but with the quiet constancy of a shadow attached to a figure that does not notice it. She sat on the floor near his chair when he read. She repeated his words under her breath in the half-second after he said them. She arranged his papers when he left the room, sorted with the same system he used, in the same precise sequence. She sat at his desk and mimed the motion of signing her name in the air above the ledger, her finger moving in the exact flourish of his signature, though she could not write a single letter. He told himself it was endearing. He even laughed once, a dry, hollow sound that startled the cook in the adjacent room. "She has taken after her daddy," he said. But the laughter did not survive the week. One evening at supper, when he had finished his blessing and raised his head, he found her still bowed, her lips moving. "What are you muttering?" he asked. She looked up, her face was perfectly composed. "I am saying what you said to Mama," she told him. "Before she died, I am saying it for her so she remembers it." The fork dropped from his hand. "What did I say to her?" His voice had gone very quiet, in the way that quiet is sometimes a warning, the stillness before the weather changes. Leia tilted her head. Her expression was the same as when she was working out a puzzle. "You said you made me love you wrong." He stared at her. "Who told you that?" His voice had gone rigid now. "Who put those words in your mouth?" "Mama did," she said. "When I was sitting with her mirror, her mouth did not move, but I heard it anyway." He slammed his glass down. "Enough." The word came out ragged, stripped of its usual composure. "Do you hear me? Enough of this." She flinched. She went small in her chair with the automatic quickness of long practice. But she did not look afraid exactly. She looked resigned, the way you look when something you have predicted comes true, when the world confirms what you already suspected about it. The next morning, he took her to stand before her mother's mirror in the upstairs room. He pulled the black cloth back. He made her look at her own reflection. "Look at yourself," he said. His voice had the quality of something being forced through a very narrow space. "You are not one of them. You never were. You are mine. You remember that." She looked at the glass. The girl in the mirror looked back. Tangled hair, sun-darkened skin, bare feet below the hem of a too-formal dress. Eyes with a quality in them that she had not had before the quarters and that the quarters had not exactly given her. That quality belonged to neither place, was the product of both, was something that forms in the space between two worlds when a person has been required to live in neither. "She looks like you when you get mad," Leia said softly. He raised his hand. He held it there. He could not tell in that moment whether he intended to strike her or whether the motion was simply the only response his body knew to make when the truth came at him from a direction he had not anticipated. He looked at her in the mirror. He looked at himself looking at her. He put his hand down. "Get out of my sight," he said. "Go on." She left the room. But just before she turned the corner of the doorway, she reached back and pressed her palm flat against the surface of the mirror. The glass was cold. She held her hand there for a moment, feeling that cold move up through her fingers and into her wrist and up her arm. Then she was gone. The handprint remained in the dust on the glass for 3 days before anyone wiped it away. And they found after that scratched lightly into the walnut frame of the mirror with something small and sharp, a single short sentence. It was written in a child's unsteady hand, each letter large and slightly uneven, the work of someone who had taught herself in secret, practicing on stolen moments. "I'm still listening." Word moves on a plantation the way water moves, not through open channels but through every crack and seam and invisible low place in the landscape. It does not announce itself. It arrives already having traveled. The women in the quarters began hearing things in November, after the lights started going early and the cold settled in like a permanent guest who has stopped pretending it will leave. They heard the sounds that drifted down the hill on certain nights, the sound of a door slamming, the sound of a man's voice rising to the upper registers where volume has stopped being communication and become something else entirely. And under those sounds, barely audible, the thin, broken hum of a child who no longer cried when hurt because she had been taught that crying was evidence of a character defect. Mabel heard it first clearly one night while emptying her wash water, a rhythmic sound from the upper rooms of the house, hard and deliberate. She stood in the cold with her bucket and listened until she was certain of what it was, and then she pressed her fist against her mouth and stood for a long time breathing through her nose, because screaming was not an option that the world she lived in offered her. By morning, Leia had bruises on her forearms that could not be explained by falling. The housekeeper Essie said she had taken a tumble on the stairs. She said it with her eyes very fixed on a point somewhere past Mabel's left shoulder. Nobody said anything. Nobody ever said anything on land like that about things like that. The saying was more dangerous than the silence, and everyone on those grounds had long since done the calculation. But that night Mabel gathered the women in her cabin. "She is up there dying slow," she said, "and she will finish dying if nobody does a thing." Ruth's hands were shaking. "What are we supposed to do? He is the master. You go near that house without being called for, you do not come back looking the same." "Maybe," Mabel said, "but I cannot sit here in the warm and listen to that child forget she is a human person. I have buried enough children on this land. I am not burying her without trying." The argument lasted most of the night. In the end, it was not an argument anyone won. It was just an argument that ran out of road when set against the thing that was actually happening up the hill. 2 nights later, Mabel and Ruth crept through the dark field, keeping to the shadows along the fence line, the cold grass brushing their ankles and the smell of cypress and turned earth and wood smoke in the air. The house door was unlocked. It had been unlocked for months now, as though the master had lost interest in the pretense of fortification, as though he no longer believed there was anything inside worth protecting. They found the house in a state of slow collapse. Not structural, the walls still stood, the roof still held, but the interior had the quality of a place that had stopped insisting on itself. Furniture overturned and not righted. Candles burned to their bases and not replaced, papers scattered from the study across the hall floor, glasses with dried rings at the bottom lined along the mantel like evidence in a case that no one was building. And in the middle of it all, the parlor, and in the parlor, the piano, and at the piano, Leia. She sat on the bench with her back very straight and her hands suspended over the keys in a posture that would have looked, to someone watching from the doorway, like she was playing. But she was not touching the keys. Her hands hovered. Her fingers moved faintly in the pattern of something she was playing only in her head, in some interior concert hall where the rules about what was allowed to exist were different. Her eyes were open but not seeing anything in the room. Her dress was torn at the shoulder. Mabel crossed to her in 3 quick steps and took her by the shoulders. "Baby, it is me. It is Mabel." The girl blinked as though surfacing from deep water. Her eyes moved, found Mabel's face. "Mabel," she said softly, "I have been waiting for you. Come on now, we are going home." But from the doorway at the back of the parlor, a low voice said, "She is home." The master stood in the threshold half in shadow, his shirt hanging open, a pistol at his side with the studied casualness of a man who has thought carefully about what it means to carry one. His face in the candlelight was drawn into the geography of a man who had spent months losing an argument with himself, and losing badly, and does not yet understand that the losing is the only honest thing he has done. "She does not belong down there anymore," he said. "She belongs here. She has always belonged here." Mabel turned to face him. She was afraid, of course she was afraid. She had been afraid of men like this her entire life. But there was something beyond the fear that had taken up residence in her chest, something denser and older than fear, and it spoke through her voice without consulting her. "She don't belong to nobody no more," Mabel said. "You done made sure of that yourself." The pistol rose a half-inch, his hand trembled. "You think you can take her from me?" Behind them, Leia spoke. "You don't have to take me." Both of them turned. She was standing, her hands flat against the piano lid, her back straight, her feet bare on the cold floor. Her voice was not a child's voice in that moment. It was not a woman's voice either. It was the voice of a person who has run out of performance and arrived at something underneath it, something that has been waiting quietly with extraordinary patience for the performance to end. "I already gone," she said. The room held its breath. "I already gone," she said again, as if the saying of it was how it became true. The master took a step forward. "Don't talk foolish, girl, you ain't gone nowhere." Her eyes moved to Mabel, then Ruth, then back to him. "I ain't here either," she said. I've been walking around in the space between ever since Mama went. You put me there. You didn't mean to, but you did." His voice cracked. "I gave you everything I had left." Mabel stepped in front of the girl. "You didn't give her nothing but your ghosts." "Move aside." "No." The pistol rose to level. And then Leia stepped around Mabel and stood before him in the candlelight, and her face held the expression of a child who has finally decided something, not in the way of choices between easy things, but in the way of accepting the only door that is actually open. "You can hit me," she said softly. "That is what you do when you love someone, right? That is what you always said. That is what it felt like, so go on." He froze. "Who told you that?" His voice had gone to a register she had never heard from him before, something broken at the bottom of it, like a note a piano cannot quite reach. "You did," she said, "every time." The pistol slipped from his hand. It hit the floor and discharged. The sound of it was enormous, filling the house, pouring out the windows, rolling down the hill. Smoke rose in a white curl from the parlor floor. The bullet had found the piano's body. The wood splintered outward in a wound, and from inside the instrument's darkness, a single string struck and suddenly slack, released a note that was not a note so much as the sound a sound makes when it has nothing left to sustain it. The note hung in the air and faded. And the man fell to his knees on the parlor floor and put his face in his hands and wept in the way of men who have wept very little and waited very long, and now cannot find the bottom of it. Leia looked down at him. "See," she said quietly, "you cannot kill what you already broke. This is Hollow Century. If this story is moving you, if it is sitting somewhere in you, please subscribe and share it. These are the stories history tried to silence. Every view, every share, every comment is a small act of refusal. We tell these stories because someone has to. Thank you for being here." After that night, the master did not appear in the fields again. He did not appear at his window. He did not send down orders. The smoke from the chimney grew thin and then intermittent, and then one morning it stopped altogether, and the overseer stood looking up at the silent house for a long time before sending one of the men to knock. No one answered. Leia came back to the quarters on her own 2 days later. She came at dawn, walking barefoot down the hill path in the plain white dress Ruth had sewn for her from muslin scraps, her hair loose around her shoulders, her doll tucked against her ribs. She came through the doorway and stood in the center of the cabin and looked at Mabel. Mabel looked at her for a long moment, then she opened her arms. The girl walked into them and stood there being held and did not make any sound at all. She ate that night for the first time in days and slept beside Mabel on the cot with the old woman's arm across her. But sleep was not what it should have been. She woke in the dark several times and lay very still, listening to something the others could not hear. And in the morning her eyes had that quality, looking slightly past whatever was directly in front of her, tuned to a frequency that existed somewhere adjacent to the visible world. "Papa ain't quiet," she told Mabel the third morning. "He is still talking." Mabel looked at her carefully. "There ain't nobody up that hill to talk, baby." Leia shook her head slowly. "I know, that is why I can hear him so clear." Over the following weeks, small impossible things began to happen in the quarters. Tools rearranged between sundown and sunrise, wash lines pulled loose from their posts in windless air, water buckets overturned in the night. The disturbances followed no pattern that could be explained by rats or wind or the settling of old wood, but each one was precise in the way the master had been precise. Nothing chaotic. Everything moved to a slightly more ordered position, a slightly more supervised one. When Mabel asked Leia about it, the girl said simply, "He don't like mess." She stopped answering to her name as reliably. When called, she would turn and look, then sometimes say with an expression of genuine puzzlement, "That is what she used to call me." And when asked who, she would say, "Mama." She said it the way you say the name of someone who is standing right beside you and everyone else is pretending not to see. She walked the hill path to the ruin of the house every few days, going without ceremony and coming back quieter each time. Ruth tried once to stop her. "Don't go up there, baby. Nothing is waiting for you but pain." Leia smiled at her with patience. "It don't hurt no more," she said. "It just remembers." And her voice, in saying it, had a rhythm that made Ruth's spine prickle, a low, steady cadence that did not belong to a child. Mabel knew by then that something needed to happen, that the thing settling into the girl, her father's presence, or what remained of it, or what she believed remained of it, which in the end may be the same thing, was not going to be dislodged by time alone. It needed a place to go. There was one place on that land that had received the worst of what the Brantham family had done to each other. One place where the water ran dark and remembered everything and held what was given to it without releasing. The river where the willows trailed their fingers in the current as if searching for something they had dropped. One night in late autumn, when the moon was 3/4 full and the air smelled of rain coming, Mabel woke Ruth. "We are going to the river," she said, "tonight." Ruth pulled on her shawl without arguing. She had learned, by then, to trust the direction Mabel pointed, even when she could not see what Mabel was seeing. They wrapped Leah in a blanket and led her through the dark fields. The girl came without resistance. She seemed, in fact, to have been expecting it, to have been waiting for this particular door to open. When they reached the bank, she stopped. The river ran black and slow before them, the moon's reflection broken into moving pieces on the surface. The willows stood in the dark. The girl looked toward the hill where the grave was, as though she could feel the direction of it in her body. "This is where Mama sleeps," she said quietly. "That is right," Mabel said. Leah crouched at the water's edge. She touched the surface with her fingertips once, and the touch spread out in rings that caught the moonlight and glinted silver before smoothing away. "He says he cannot find the door," she said. "He says he has been walking the room so long he forgot there is an outside." Ruth gripped her shawl tight. "He ain't your responsibility. He says he is sorry." Her voice was completely without inflection, like reading something from a page. "He says he is so sorry." Mabel knelt beside her in the mud. She took the girl's wet hands in her own. "He ain't got the right to your forgiveness," she said. "He gave it up. Some things once given up do not come back." "I know," Leah said. "Then you leave him to his hall," Mabel said. "You hear me? You leave him where he is and you come back to this side." Leah looked at the water. The surface reflected her face back at her, fragmented and shifting, never quite whole. "Maybe I am the door," she said softly. "Maybe that is all I ever was to him, the way out." She pressed both palms flat against the water. And the river changed. There is no other way to say it. The surface of the water where her hands touched it went pale, the color of milk poured into black water, spreading outward from her palms in slow, illuminated rings that caught no light because the light was coming from within them. The rings spread and spread, and the sound of the river changed too, became lower, slower, as though the water had been asked a question and was taking its time with the answer. "Leah," Mabel's voice shook, "you come back now." "He is tired," the girl murmured. "He says he just wants to rest." "Then let him rest somewhere else," Ruth said. Her voice was barely a sound. "You do not have to carry him to his bed." "He will be quiet," Leah said. "If I let him go, he will stop talking." "And if you do not?" Mabel asked. She already knew the answer. She had known it, she thought, since the first night the girl arrived with her broken doll and her broken song and her father's entire world lodged inside her like a splinter too deep to see. "Then I will go where he is," Leah said, "and be quiet myself." Mabel grabbed her shoulders and tried to pull her back. The girl's weight had changed somehow, not heavier, but more insistent, the way deep water is insistent when it has made up its mind about direction. The pale light spread around Leah's hands and moved up her arms in slow, faint threads. The surface of the water shimmered like a held breath, like something enormous deciding whether to let go. "Baby," Mabel said, her voice breaking entirely now. "You do not owe nobody your light, you hear me? Nobody, not him, not this land, not what he made of you." Leah turned her head slowly and looked at the old woman. Her eyes in the river glow were very clear, clearer than Mabel had ever seen them, clearer than they had been in any of the months since the girl had arrived in the quarters with the world's damage written through her. "I am not giving it to him," she said gently. "I am spending it, so he stops needing it, so he leaves me alone." She paused, and the pause had something in it that was almost peace. "So I can be quiet on my own side." The last light moved from her hands into the water. The pale glow spread to the far bank and held there for a moment, as if contemplating itself, and then the river let it go, absorbed it, dissolved it, took it down into the current and the dark and the deep where things that have been held too long are finally allowed to stop being held. The water went black again, normal water, moving water, river water doing what river water does. Leah fell backward into Mabel's arms, eyes still open, lips slightly parted, hands still dripping water that caught the moonlight as it fell from her fingers and struck the ground. "He is quiet now," she whispered. Then her eyes closed. He said thank you. Then she was still. Mabel held the girl in the mud beside the river and rocked her and did not speak for a long time. Ruth knelt nearby. She was not crying. She had passed through the place where crying was possible into a place beyond it, a place of deep, dry understanding that sits on the other side of grief and is quieter than grief but heavier and does not go away when the immediate pain recedes. Leia's pulse was there. For a while it was there. They carried her back through the dark fields, the dew-wet grass brushing their legs, the house on the hill standing black and lightless against the sky. They laid her by the hearth and covered her with the muslin blanket, and the women of the quarters gathered around her in the firelight without being called because they knew. The way people on that land always knew things that had not been told through the particular language of air and silence and the feeling that comes before words. The girl's breathing slowed through the night, becoming the kind of breathing that is its own goodbye. By dawn it had stopped. The fire in the hearth burned on without her. Outside, birds began to call in the trees. That was the first thing the women noticed, birds singing for the first time in months. Not the alarm calls of startled things, not the thin, frightened chirp of a creature that has been conditioned by proximity to danger, but the full, unhurried song of creatures that have felt something lift from the air and are responding to that lifting the only way they know how. The plantation breathed differently that day. Even the sky seemed lighter at its edges. Mabel sat outside in the morning cold and did not speak to anyone. She looked at the hill. The house stood empty and grey. She thought about the girl who had arrived in the dirt of the quarters with a broken doll and her father's language living in her like a squatter, who had let these women love her while she slowly, painfully, began to rewrite every lesson the house had given her. Who had gone to the river not to destroy herself, but to put down what she had been carrying in the only way she could find, not because she had forgiven the man who had given it to her, but because she refused to die still carrying it. She did not forgive him because he deserved it, Mabel said finally, to Ruth who had come to sit beside her. No, Ruth said. She let him go because she was done being his, Mabel said. That is different, that is harder. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Is it forgiveness if you do it for yourself? Mabel considered. Maybe that is the only kind that means anything. They buried her near the magnolia trees, in a grave that no one marked with a stone because stones could be removed and they wanted this to be permanent, something that could not be taken away, could not be cleared, could not be erased by any subsequent owner of the land. Mabel pressed her palm to the turned earth when they were done, the way the girl had pressed her palm to the river's surface, and she left it there for a moment, feeling the cold and the damp and the dark beneath. You got your peace, she whispered. You earned it. The nights that followed were uneasy. 3 days after the burial, Ruth woke to footsteps in the yard, small, light, barefoot steps moving in the familiar pattern of a child doing her rounds. She went to the window. The yard was empty, but on the ground near the fire pit, she found a handprint pressed into the soft dirt, small and precise and faintly pale at the center, as though the earth itself remembered. People began to see her, not often, not clearly. At dusk by the river, a small figure in white standing at the water's edge with her hands at her sides, facing the current. At the foot of the hill path, looking up toward the house with an expression that was not sorrow and not accusation, but something more like the look of someone who has made a long journey and reached the end of it, and is simply acknowledging where they have arrived. They called her the listening child. They called her the quiet girl. The name that lasted was the milk daughter, for the white shimmer on the river that morning, for the color of the light that left her hands, for the way the water still ran pale some mornings when the fog came down low and the light had not yet decided what color the day would be. Mabel did not speak of it. She lit a candle every year on the night of the first frost and carried it to the riverbank and set it in the mud and watched its reflection in the water until the cold made staying any longer a question of stubbornness rather than reverence. Years later, a child from the newer families followed her there and asked why. Mabel kept her eyes on the water. Because some souls don't rest where they die, she said. They rest where they forgive. Did she forgive him? Mabel was quiet a long time, long enough for the candle's reflection to waver twice in the current. She let him go, she finally said. That is harder than forgiving. Forgiving, you give something to a person. Letting go, you take something back from them. She took herself back. That is what the river was for. The boy looked at the water. Then why do we still light candles for her? Mabel's voice had the quality of something that had been said many times and still had not run out of meaning. Because letting go cost her everything, and somebody ought to remember what it costs. The Brantham plantation does not appear in any county record after 1849. The land changed hands and changed hands again, sold in parcels to men who had no knowledge of what had happened on it, and each time it was sold it went cheaper than the assessors expected, as though the ground itself was not cooperating with its own valuation. Nothing grew well there after a certain point. The soil stayed pale and dry in patches that defied the river's proximity. Eventually, the fields were left untended and the fields did not protest. The house collapsed some years later, not dramatically, no fire, no storm, no sudden catastrophe to tell. It simply stopped holding itself together. The roof failed first, then the floors, then the walls, incrementally, the way things fall apart when the will that was sustaining them is gone, when there is no one left who needs it to stand. The story survived all of it. Not in books, not in official accounts, in the way stories survive that were never meant to be official, passed from mouth to ear in the dark, told in the specific register of the voice people use when they want a thing to travel without being intercepted, the register of necessary things. The older folks always started it the same way. There was a child who carried a man's worst self inside her, and she carried it all the way to the river, and she put it down, and that is why the water there still sometimes runs pale at the edges when the fog comes in before dawn. The younger ones asked if she had been brave. The older ones said, brave is not the right word for what she was. Brave is a word for people who have a choice. She did not have a choice. She had something rarer. She had a refusal. At the end of everything he had done to her and through her and with her, she refused to become the next version of him. She looked at what she was holding and chose. In the one moment she was given that particular choice, to be the last place it lived. That refusal is the whole story. Because cruelty is not a force of nature, it is not weather, it is not gravity. It is a thing that moves through people, through the hands that inflict it, through the bodies that receive it, through the children who witness it and absorb its rhythms before they have language for what they are absorbing. It moves because it is carried. It survives because the carried thing is handed to the next person before the person carrying it has had a chance to understand what they are holding. Leah understood the weight. That was what the women in the quarters gave her, not the ability to put it down exactly, but the knowledge of what she was carrying. You cannot put down something you have not yet recognized in your own hands. Once she recognized it, she spent the rest of her short life walking toward the water. The people who lived near that land for generations afterwards said it in different ways, in different words at different times of year. But they always said some version of the same thing, that the broken children are not broken by nature, that what looks like damage is sometimes knowledge, and what looks like wildness is sometimes the attempt to survive in a landscape where the rules were all written by the people who were harming you, and that the question is never whether the damage can be undone. The question is whether someone will stand close enough, and long enough, and with enough patience, to let the child learn a different shape for the world. The women of those quarters stood close, they stood long. They did it without being asked, without being compensated, without any guarantee that it would work, on a piece of land that had taken almost everything from them already. They offered what was left. That is what the story is, not the cruelty, not the ghost, not the pale light on the water or the broken piano or the handprint in the dirt. Those are the conditions of the story. The story itself is smaller and harder and more important, that even there, even then, even in a place built for breaking, someone chose not to pass the breaking on. The river still runs through that land. It runs past the place where the house stood. It runs past the magnolias and the unmarked grave and the pale dry patches in the soil. It runs the way rivers run, without memory and full of it, carrying everything and releasing nothing, or releasing it so slowly that the releasing looks like keeping. When the mist sits low over the river in the early morning, and the water catches the first grey light of dawn in a way that makes it look almost white at the edges, the people who still live in that part of Mississippi close their windows quietly, not from fear, from respect. Because some stories do not end with fire. Some stories end with a child walking to the water and saying, in the only way she has left, "This ends with me. This does not go any further. I am the last place this lives." And the river takes it. And the morning comes. And somewhere in the quiet that follows, if you hold very still and let the mist touch your face and listen with the part of you that is older than language, older than fear, older than all the names you have been given for what you are, you can hear it. That small uneven hum, carrying across the water, neither joyful nor mournful, just present, just honest, the sound of something that was broken choosing even so to be beautiful. You have been watching Hollow Century, where forgotten darkness lives. If this story moved you, if it sat somewhere in you and stayed, subscribe to this channel and ring the bell. Every story here was buried once. Every one of them survived because someone refused to let it disappear. That refusal is what we do here every single week. Leave a comment below. Tell us what this story meant to you. Tell us which part stayed. We will see you at the next forgotten chapter. History does not end, it waits to be told.